Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the second week of our training course organized under the umbrella of the Erasmus Plus project OBEC. For the people that have joined us last week as well, I would like to welcome you back. For the people that have joined us for the first time today, I would like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Yip. I'm Junior Project Officer here at EURADA, and together with my colleague Tessa, I will host this week's course on the circular economy. The structure of the course is slightly different than the one from last week. Today we are going to jump right into the topic because we have two external speakers today, Mr. Eddy Wille and Pierre Condamine, and our own Jerome Friedrichs. So that will be very interesting, and due to some scheduling issues, we are starting right away with the first presentation regarding waste management. And I'd like to introduce to you our next speaker, Mr. Eddy Wille, who holds a master's degree of science in geology from Ghent University in Belgium. He is the senior advisor of the dynamic landfill management and brownfield rehabilitation at the Public Waste Agency of Flanders, also known as OVAM, and has been involved in research for the World Health Organization regarding urban development of contaminated sites. And today, Mr. Wille will introduce you to the topic of landfills and brownfields. And Mr. Wille, if you are ready, I'm leaving the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Yip, for this kind of introduction. Good morning, everyone. As Yip told you, I will give you an introduction to waste management, and especially on what's the result or the impact from the old linear economy on our landscape and our land specifically. And that's the reason why I will get you in detail on landfills and brownfield redevelopment. So I'm also thankful to the people from Interreg Northwest Europe, the Generatis project, which is a specifically project dealing with contaminated sites and also rehabilitation of former landfills. So you will also see in my presentation, I recycled also quite a lot of older slides. I'm not that old, but from different presentations. So I also, let's say, put some waste hierarchy into practice by recycling my old slides. On the next slide, oops, sorry. Well, a short introduction on this topic. What's in the name if we're talking about landfills and brownfields? I will also give an overview on the history of our linear economy, because maybe it's because I'm a trained geologist, I'm always interested in the past and history. So if you want to know how everything is working and why some patterns are visible in your landscape, well, history can give you quite a lot of information on that. Also, if you're talking about linear economy, waste management, and circular economy, this is an international topic. So we are not specifically talking about the region in Belgium where I live. No, it's much more broader. You see worldwide frameworks and trends which are very important. And then something we introduced in the Cocoon project, another Interreg Europe project, was the concept of dynamic landfill management. I will give you more details on that. And then finally, I will talk about brownfield redevelopment. So maybe what's in the name? If you're talking about landfills in the United States, they often call it final waste disposal sites. So if you have your traditional linear economy by taking your raw materials, introducing them into your production system, making goods from it, you're using those goods, and at the end of the use, you get disposed of the waste. That's a traditional linear economy as we know. What we're trying to do is closing as much the loops that we have made by recycling, reusing materials. And also one of the elements I will introduce to you today is also how can we introduce older landfills or former landfills in that, let's say, economic cycle again. So from the traditional geological mining, how can we also mine our anthropogenic residues? So that's the dynamic landfill management. The other topic is brownfield redevelopment. Brownfield, or it's not only landfills, but more also the production units, the old facilities where goods were produced, where products were made, and they also had an impact on the soil, on the land, and not always content sites, but quite often, but also relics of a former linear economy, which should be redeveloped or rehabilitated. So these are the two main topics of my presentation today. You will also see there are quite a lot of slides, which I will not comment that much, but they're more, let's say, illustration of the whole story. So maybe starting with the beginning. If we are looking at the Belgian situation, it's also quite similar for many industrialized countries. Something will happen a bit sooner or later, but what we see is that there is an increasing level of the regulatory framework which comes into the picture. If you look in the early days, we see that the mayor of municipalities and cities has a very high responsibility on the safety of those cities. So a lot of legislation was made on that level, and it was the mayor, local mayor, who was responsible to keep everything safe. If we go to the later phase of industrialization in the mid-19th century in our region, but quite a lot of European member states has quite a similar history, you see that there was a labor movement which was very interested on the safety in the factories, that industrialization processes were safe for the people who worked over there. And it's not a coincidence that in those days, Karl Marx wrote his Communist Manifesto in Brussels. In those days, he was staying there, and there was quite a lot of interest in how can we act on the well-being of workers. And that was also the first legislation. And we see that's not only applicable in a city, no, that was on the level of Belgium as a federal state, as a nation. If we go further in the 20th century, we see that the degradation of the environment was becoming a hot topic. And people became much more interested in how can we safeguard our environment. And you see a lot of new legislation on that point, in our case, at the European level. So you see that the level is increasing. And now in the third millennium, what we see is that we see global sustainable development goals. We see climate actions. So the level is now on a global scale. So that is what we should keep in mind, that within 2 or 3 centuries, we started from the local level in a municipality or a city, and now we are acting global, worldwide. That also means that there is a lot of interaction, a lot of complexity if we are dealing with waste management, linear economy, circular economy. So it's not limited to a region or a city. No, we are dealing with worldwide patterns and systems. That's what I would like to introduce you. Of course, your site that you want to address, your landfill, your contaminated site, is very important for the vicinity, but also, as I mentioned, we are dealing with European legislation or global trends we should keep in mind. And that's also a bit what I try to focus on this picture, that we should use geographical information systems in order to bring as much as possible different aspects of our environment together. Not only, let's say, one site or an issue of air quality or soil quality, or how is spatial distribution. No, let's bring as much as possible information together in our databases. Also, the spatial evolution of our cities is, let's say, within 2 years, 2 centuries, 2 years would be very quickly, it evolved from what we call the agropolis, where you have a local city, a very small city, and around that city you have different layers where they were producing goods which were introduced in that city. If we see in the 20th century, they call it also the petropolis, a lot of materials were coming from far outside that city, a lot of transport, and if you see a lot of lines, you can say this is maybe why they call it also the linear economy. You need a lot of traffic to enter your products, your goods into your system and your city. On this slide, you see it a bit more detailed. So let's say this is a sort of onion model where the people are bringing goods into the city center. This is a typical city where there is a lot of production close to the city, and there is a lot of material and people who are entering that system in order to produce and consume also those goods. And this is the situation that we are now trying to achieve, that there is more interaction, more green, that there is a combination between living, producing, consuming, recreation, all those functions brought together. That's what you'll see with brownfield sites that they should be part of a broader system, not only remediating one site. No, what's the importance of the site in the broader system, in the broader evolution of the city? So this is the reason why I want to focus on this aspect. We also say that around all city centers, this is for example the city of Ghent in Belgium, quite a lot of industry was close to that old city center. And that's also what we see, that the more the city is growing, people are going to live very close or around former or current industrial facilities. So the residential areas are entering the industrial areas. That also to point out that we are talking about quite a lot of issues, not only about waste, we are talking about impact on water, groundwater, drinking water supplies, but also that there is impact of air. We have air pollution, climate change can be one of the aspects. So if you're talking about the circular economy that we want to create, we have to keep in mind that we are dealing with a lot of aspects, not only about the material itself or the scarcity of those materials, but there are quite a lot of elements involved. If you really want to create space for companies acting in the circular economy, well, you need also to find land. So there are also land restrictions. So it also means that if you're talking about the circular economy, sometimes you should also deal with the impact of your former linear economy. And that's a bit the point I want to express today and emphasize. Landfills and brownfields are typical endpoints of a linear economy. So how can we reintroduce them into a circular economy? If you're looking at a broader scale, you can also detect mega trends on a global scale. The important lesson we should keep in mind is that we have multiple systems which are connected with each other. It's not only an economic aspect, it's also about social issues, environmental issues. So all those things should be kept together. And that's also why this is important. Introducing an integrated approach is one of the key factors if you want to have success with your circular or development of a circular economy. So also coordination, decoupling growth and impact. This is really important if we are talking about material management. We can't afford this any longer, that we are digging up all kind of ore deposits, use them and then dispose them into landfills. No, there is a scarcity, also environmental impacts. There are quite a lot of good reasons to avoid that we take, make and dispose all those materials. Also, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you see impacts on economy, society and biosphere. So if you're talking about waste management, land management, you come into these aspects of having clean water, having soil good for food, life on land. So quite a lot of elements which are mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals are also applicable if we are talking about our waste management. The traditional view on a contaminated, or let's say on a linear economy side, is that we have a production unit. They are importing materials, stocks. They are processing them. They have waste. They have wastewater ponds. They have landfills. Quite often they have waste products backfilled on the site itself or brought outside. Of course, the products after use can also be discarded. So this is the traditional scheme that we see, that we have a production site where we're entering materials, and also waste streams are leaving those sites with impact on groundwater, air, and you name it. We have quite a lot of different sources, storage tanks, processing units, you name it. And also the pollutants that you see have also a great diversity. So it's going from organic products like mineral oil or aromatics. You have also salts like cyanides, but also heavy metals. Quite a lot of pollutants can enter into your environmental system. If you are talking about waste and material management, we should also keep in mind that the reserves that we have are not infinite. So there are limits. And what we see is that your energy can be limited. Quite often they speak about the peak oil. That means that we have a top of the oil production received, and also the reserves, and it will also lower. We see the same with copper, a lot of other elements, that they will diminish in the future. So scarcity might become a problem. Although people say in an economic system, the higher prices you get for scarce product, the more that will be produced. As I mentioned before, traditional mining has also a severe impact on your environmental system. So extra mining is not always the good option. Another element is that on the land that we are living, we also see that the urban sprawl is increasing. In quite a lot of regions worldwide, we see that the population is increasing and also that the populated areas are also expanding. In those cases, you see that you have specific regions in Flanders, for example, it's around the industrial access and our harbor facilities. But that also means if the urban areas are expanding, they can also reach former industrial sites or current industrial sites and also landfills. So there might be an impact, a negative impact from the land around they are reaching. So there is also a good reason to take care about your soil quality in view of the urban sprawl and the population increase which is happening. We see that also for the example I showed a few slides earlier, that the expansion of the Ghent city has also another effect. That means that the new industry is also heading from close to the city center, in this case more to the north outside the city center. So they will take more land, and that means that in many cases, let's say useful land for food production will be used for industrial activities, while otherwise still landfills or contaminated sites will remain unaddressed. So our policy is focusing first on those contaminated sites, avoiding that we take new green fields. So that's the main aspect of brownfield redevelopment.
Da,
Avoiding
okay? Da.
Sorry. Another element is that close to our city centers, we have also a lot of waterways. So what we are proposing is use more your waterways, like in this case, on the left photo, you see that waste, municipal waste from the city of Leuven is transported to the waste management center in Antwerp by using our river systems. Something we have forgotten for quite a long time is that the landfills, we think that they are static objects. We have a landfill, once it's closed, it's there forever and there will be no problem. Well, there might be a problem. We did an exercise in our region, and about 55% of our landfills are situated in areas where flooding can occur the coming decades. To say the same in England, quite a lot of landfills in England are close to the seaside, and sea erosion might occur, and waste which was deposited may enter into your sea and ocean systems. The same aspects were also seen by our colleagues from EPA in Alaska, that due to climate change and changing rain patterns, that more erosion is occurring and also landfills will be washed away. Another element that is okay if we want to avoid that land take is no longer increasing. The first thing is that we set targets. We want zero land take by 2040 in Flanders. So this means also that we should act in the recycling or redevelopment of our former contaminated site in order to avoid net land take in the future. If we're talking about material management, we also want to go from linear to circular, and these are the typical schemes that you see, that we try to avoid that a lot of raw materials should enter into your cycle, into your system, and that we try to close the cycles, to close the loops as much as possible. So only in this slide from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, you see that incineration of waste and landfilling of waste, these two streams are leaving the system. What we are seeing in quite a lot of member states is that there is an evolution in waste management. While the first steps were going from how can we collect waste and dispose it in an environmental friendly and healthy way, we set a focus more on waste hierarchy. How can we avoid that we produce a lot of landfill waste? How can we reuse, recycle it as much as possible? So we, from the first step, by collecting it in a safe way, we evolved more to closing the loops as much as possible. And that's also at European level, the waste hierarchy that we see. As I mentioned, it's not only about waste, we also should keep in mind that there are a lot of other elements, interactions are in this game. If we want to see what's the future of landfills and contaminated sites, quite a lot of landfills are also contaminating. Well, we see that you have two different viewpoints. If you ask it to people who were in favor of the punk in the 70s, they were singing there is no future. And quite a lot of people think that landfills have no future at all. But if you look at a surrealistic painter like the name Magritte, only by looking at an egg, you can also imagine a beautiful bird. So that's a bit the opposite. So you will see the extremes, no future at all, and quite a lot of opportunity. So the real thing we should do is, each landfill has its proper characteristics. We should investigate them and find out what's the best planning that we could make in order to make it to create more added value for a landfill or a contaminated site. So we should also be aware of the fact that we would have conflicting views on it, and that means that a lot of research should be done, and also the communication is very important. So it's important that we think these are complex problems we should solve. But that does not mean that if you have a complex problem that you should make it complicated. It's already complex enough, so keep it simple. Let's find out what's the real problem and how can we solve it, and how can we create a better future for those sites. This is in collaboration with my colleagues from the Department of Environmental and Spatial Development. The importance of this graph is that we should not only focus on one aspect, on air quality, on impact on groundwater. No, it's a whole system that we should keep in mind. It's about space, it's about soil, subsurface, flows and stocks we are seeing. So this is the main aspect. We should look at the system with the multiple layers in it. So not only focusing on one of the aspects, it's an integrated approach, as I earlier mentioned with the megatrends also. In the Interreg Cocoon project, we also did an analysis of what's a traditional viewpoint of vision on landfill. So what we see is that we are digging up raw materials from our natural deposits, bring them into the system, and at the end, we are landfilling them. So at the end of the linear economy, at the end of the line, it's a landfill. The question is it also the end of the story? And that's a bit disappointing. I mentioned in the earlier slide, if you have urban sprawl, you can also become into the vicinity of a landfill. So the contact will be very close. If you have flooding risk, also your landfill can become mobile in a way that you don't want it. And the main vision on landfill till now was based, as I would say, on a risk-based approach. We have a source of contaminants or landfill wastes, and we have a target, which could be threatened, in our case, mostly humans. So what we should keep in mind is there a pathway between the landfill and its contaminants and the human beings around it? If there is a pathway, that means that there is a serious risk for those people. The only point is, if we are containing the landfill, how is it an internal containment? And there we should keep in mind that eternity would not be the case because of the fact that our nature is a dynamic system. It can take times. We all know that, for example, the Ice Age is already 10,000 years ago. So some natural events will take many thousand years. But if we look now, for example, in our region, the climate change, and also in the western part of Germany, last year we had enormous floodings, and also a lot of waste was not only created, but also landfills were flooded and washed away. We saw it in Normandy, in France, also in the Alps. So these are new patterns we should keep in mind. and also detect those landfills which are very vulnerable to those elements. But on the other side, we also see that we have scarcity of materials. So could we set up landfills also in a broader system by reintegrating or recycling those materials for our circular economy? So that's also one of the elements that we introduced in what we call the dynamic landfill management. I have to admit, quite a lot of landfills will not be suitable to material recovery because it's too diverse, too mixed, or too old. But there are certain landfills, especially landfills with one stream. There, even at this moment, that kind of landfills are recycled. Just have to keep an eye on my watch. Okay, I have to speed up a bit. So this is the main issue. What we are trying to do from the old system, we are digging up raw materials, using them, and then putting them in landfills, evolving to a circular economy where we try to avoid that we are landfilling waste and using former landfills as much as possible. It can be the surface of the landfills, it can also be the content. But the question is, how can we bring all landfills in line with the circular economy? First thing that we do is the traditional view. What we are doing with the landfill is making what I call a conceptual site model and finding out what's coming out of it. What's the impact of an old landfill on the environment or the people who are living around it. Seldom they were characterizing what's in the landfill. Well, and that's what we need if we want to make an analysis. Is it a recyclable landfill or not? So we should pay more attention to the content of a landfill. That's a difference. Another element is that we should also look at the dynamics of the system. As I mentioned before, a landfill is evolving inside. You have degradation processes, you have leaching, but also the world around it is evolving. You have, let's say, anthropogenic dynamics. Population is growing and needs more space. So if you have the external dynamics, natural or climate change, for example, which is also happening. So that should also be part of our analysis. That's the reason why we also say the conceptual site model is useful if you want to see the impact, but if you want to talk about the redevelopment of a landfill, what's the future, you should look at the whole system. And that means that you have different time frames. For example, if you have serious groundwater pollution, you should act in a very quick way. If you see that you have materials inside which can be valuable, but not at this time, but maybe within 20 years, you can, for example, put solar panels in it and bridge the gap of 20 years by producing electricity and then again evaluate the potential mining of the landfill. So there are quite a lot of different elements. As I mentioned, also the scale. You have microprocesses in the landfill itself, but also you can have landfill gas which can enter your air, your atmosphere, and methane gases is also one of the problems with greenhouse gases. So the effects are on the micro scale inside the landfill, just around the landfill, and also on a global scale. So remember, the increase of complexity, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is typical for landfills, and also if we are dealing with it, we should look at the whole system and not only at the landfill as one object. So also rethinking should be in time frames, as I mentioned. For example, in our region, we already detected more over 3,000 sites with landfill material. We could not remediate them in 1 or 2 years. So we also have a planning which is now reaching to 2,100. So that's one of the elements. We should think in 4D, not only the volume, but the volume in a time perspective. So that's one of the main lessons we have learned. So if you're talking about a complex system, this is made by my colleagues from Circular Flanders. We have ecosystems, we have socioeconomic systems, and we have sinks. And then is the question, how can we close the loops, reintegrate and avoid that the sinks or the materials in the sinks are as low as possible? And what we are doing is trying also to reintegrate those landfills, those sinks, as new areas for industry living, or even the materials. As I mentioned, it's complex. There are multiple stakeholders, the levels, also the timeframes, as I mentioned, but also disciplines. It's not only about environmental issues. We're talking about material processing, economy, social aspects. So keep in mind that we are dealing with a lot of elements in the game. So if you want to keep it simple, that's right, but that does not mean that you should not have an overview of all the aspects in your system. That's the reason by keeping it simple that I often use an onion diagram, because it's very easy. You can see what's the waste, what's the capping of the waste, what's on the landfill site, within the borders of the landfill site, outside, but also who's involved. You have the operator, the landowner, the neighbors. Also, how far are we going from the site to the global level? So this gives you a very easy concept to identify your players and elements in the rehabilitation project. This is what we have made in the Interreg Rawful project, and you have mentioned also here the internet site. We have made a landfill miner guide. So I won't go into details, but what we have done is we have made a landfill miner guide which gives you information on how to make inventories, databases, which information is useful in this, and also what kind of decision supports can we offer you in order to find out what can be done or how should a landfill be rehabilitated. So this is a bit an overview of this, what we have produced. If you're interested, please, it's free. You can go on the website to read it. We also have what we call the roadmap in order to give you a very easy overview what type of questions should be answered and what kind of options do you have. So this is also on the dashboard, which is available on the same website. And it gives you also access to specific decision support tools, which are free available at this moment. So if you want to go into detail, please take a chance on this website. If we're talking about land and landfill management, we should keep in mind that we have not only software, as I mentioned, we have computer models which you can use. We need also hardware in order to do the investigations, geophysical methods, processing methods. But quite often what we forget is we also need hardware. How can we make it work? How can we make it happen? And then we are talking about communication, governments who are creating a regulatory framework in order to give or lower the uncertainties to process or to redevelop contaminated sites. This is one of the important things that we also detected. It's not only a question about software and hardware, also the mindset is important in this case. This is a bit more in detail. For example, this is what we detected for landfills. We have our models over here, our software. We have our geophysical prospection methods. We have material flows and also processing systems you can use. And if we're talking about the hardware, this is more, how can we create a policy which is making this happening? How can we introduce fiscal measures? How can we create institutional support, accreditations, for example, for people who want to investigate sites, who want to process waste and so on. So this is the connection on landfills. And this is what's happening in the currently happening. Over here, you see former landfills which were processed, partly better contained, and a residential area was put in place. This landfill is completely processed and evacuated from the site because this chemical facility wants to expand. This was the most easy way. This rusty heap is containing iron containing material which can be fully recycled. So this will be emptied and used in another production process. Over here, we processed an old landfill in order to create a reservoir for stormwater. At this slide, you see a solar panel park, recreation. We also evacuate and sometimes landfills in order to stimulate better biodiversity. So quite a lot of options can be chosen. Of course, not each option is, let's say, economic feasible. So that's also part of the org where if we really want it, we should also invest money from the government. So far the landfills. Now we will come to the contaminated sites and especially the brownfield sites. This is typical aspects of formal coke manufacturing plants, which is completely demolished, cleaned, and soil is remediated in order to integrate it in the harbor of Bruges. We see also that in Europe last year in November, they also introduced a new strategy on contaminated land. You say the same system as with waste management. Try to avoid that your land is taken or contaminated, reuse it, minimize and compensate. So this is also what we are introducing in our brownfield program, trying to reuse as much as possible our contaminated land in order to avoid that green should be taken into let's say a land take for soil sealing and so on. This is a bit the cycle that we identified. This is a green field. If we have industrial activities on it, we can have spills. And the more that we are evolving, the more that we can, let's say, enter into what we call a black field, where the contamination is that high that there is no, let's say that you need governmental actions in order to get rehabilitation of those sites. I think it's nearly 9:45. That also means that if you're talking about the redevelopment of those sites, we should first introduce regulations that certain products are no longer allowed because they can have a very negative impact on our environmental system. For example, PCBs were no longer allowed. Asbestos in our region is moreover 20 years no longer allowed. We have also environmental permits in order to avoid that they are operating in a way that they are polluting the environment. We have also inspections, taxes. For example, we have taxes on landfilling in order to make it expensive so that people would consider recycling more or avoiding waste as much as possible. We also try to make agreements that we say, for example, for petrol stations, there is an old program that the petrol stations will be remediated in a period of about 20 years, I think. So this is with an overview on what types of regulations you can use. What I also mentioned before, it's not only about cleaning up the environment and improving soil quality, it's also about economy, spatial planning, housing, also heritage. Quite a lot of elements should be taken into account if you're talking about landfill, brownfield redevelopment. This is what I mentioned. Sometimes the cost of redevelopment can be that high and the benefits so low that only public institutions will be able to act. Also, what we see is that the uncertainty of redevelopment is an important element in the decision making. So what we're trying to do is to lower the uncertainties as much as possible. So a good site investigation is one of the elements, but also, as I mentioned, the OVAM, that you create a legal framework which is also lowering uncertainties in remediating former contaminated land. This is an overview made by our colleagues from British Geological Survey and University of Cranberry. It gives a good overview of this interaction. You have, let's say, the typical environmental investigations and the risk analysis, and also the planning aspects of the redevelopment. This should be an integrated process. You cannot only say we do the whole in soil investigation, we set up remediation actions, and when everything is remediated, then we're going to find out what will be the best future for this area. No, it should be an interaction from the beginning. That gives you also the best results, the best added value, and also you have mostly also support of the local agents and also the neighborhoods. So this is a few examples where you have a former petrol producing refinery in the harbor of Antwerp. So there is only, let's say, a small area reserved now for that. Most actions are more in the north of the harbor. And this will be completely reserved for activities with regard to circular economy. So heavily contaminated site is reworked. It's also connected with the river system so that you can have also also this name Blue Gate, that we can also have water transport by the waterways, which is much more sustainable. If we're talking about landfills, I mentioned you have several aspects. For example, over here, the value of the material inside the landfill is not high, or it's even not a waste stream which is needed in our current production processes. So they isolated it and they put solar panels on it. So it's producing an equivalent of 4,000 households. Over here you see a former in the chemical side. It's completely, let's say, isolated. Material is processed and immobilized, and at this moment it's a new container terminal. So that means that we don't need to take new greenfields in order to install a container terminal. This is the example, as I mentioned. The petrochemical facility can expand by eliminating its former landfill. You can also see this at the level of the Ghent city, that you see, for example, the more that you go to the north outside the current city center and where the residential area, you see small business areas for small businesses, more former industrial facilities. This is the landfill, but also the adjacent site is remediated and will be available for harbor activities. So closer to the cities, you see housing projects, and south on a former landfill, you see a logistic area and the new facilities for the University of Ghent. So quite a lot of different destinations around the city which are recycling, rehabilitating former industrial sites. So this is an overview in order to say this is a traditional way. What is important for finding out how should we remediate the site. If you're talking about rehabilitation or remediation, the development of sites, also the vicinity around the site is important. But this is, let's say, just an overview. If you want to know more, we wrote last year in December a publication for the World Health Organization. Currently, there are already 4 versions in French, English, German, and Russian. There's one coming in Czech, so I put the website address on it. So this is giving an overview. What should you keep in mind if you want to deal with contaminated sites? And over here you see other websites from European Union or World Health Organization where you can find more additional information. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I know it's early in the morning, so I hope everybody survived this.
Thank you, Mr. Wille.
And enjoy the rest of the sessions.
If we may, we have a question for you. Well, actually, I see there are both. One in Slido asks rather the same one as what we have in the chat, namely, what role can education play in speeding up the transition to a circular economy from your point of view? And what could businesses do as well as individuals?
Yeah, good question. This is one of the elements that we also think that we have projects starting from, let's say, kids in school from their age from 7 to 8 years even. So from the beginning, we're trying to remind them waste production, what's the problem, what you should keep in mind, how should you take care of your environment. But what more important is also that we have contacts with our university and also teaching our students this moment, how should we introduce or make the transition to a circular economy. So last week I was also at university in Ghent. We are in collaboration with professors and students in order to exchange our, let's say, experiences. I'm not teaching, let's say, the science behind it. It's more about our experience. What do we need? And what's important for a governmental, for a civil agent or servant? What do we need to deal with this kind of issues and problems? And also, it's important in our staff, we need also people who are trained in all those aspects from material management, geology. So it starts at the university, it starts, let's say, in the first years of school, but it's also at university scale. We really need those things. As I mentioned, I studied geology. So I was trained, especially in groundwater flows, but I learned later on at OVAM and also in the United States with colleagues from Environmental Protection Agency, the specific aspects of groundwater contamination. So, and then also we introduced it in our own educational reports. If you're talking about the private industry, we also see that quite a lot of companies are introducing elements of sustainability. So they are, it's not only a fact of it's costing us money, that's of course one of the elements, but also that they want to have a certain image of sustainability. So they're no longer, let's say, producing or using materials in a way that we used to and dispose it. Now they are also trying to close the circle. Also, what we see is that certain banks don't want to give loans if the project is not sustainable enough. Also, if you want to have a brownfield project accredited by the Flemish government, you need also to prove what is the sustainability degree of your project. So it's in both ways that we are acting, facilitating if we can, regulating, but also quite a lot of companies having their own communication and their own governance, a lot of elements on sustainability and circular economy.
During your presentation, you briefly touched upon the difference between brownfield and blackfield. Are blackfields ever redestined for housing in Flanders?
I have to take, I'm thinking of an example. Yes, we have former gasworks, which is rehabilitated. One of the elements is that we did a cleanup, partly, and then we, not a private company, but a local development company from the local community from the city took over. In the Germany, they call it Stadtwerke. So it's a public initiative from the local municipality. But we have even a newer brownfield, which is redeveloped as a recreational and nature area. So we can really we can arrange it that the blackfield can become a new area for recreation in safe conditions. But then you need funding from a governmental perspective.
Okay, thank you. Yep, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, we have one more question coming from the comment section in Zoom. Maybe it's a good idea if we could answer that question. And the question is from Jean-Pierre. Welcome back. The question is, do you produce educational material for vulnerable people as well in easy terms and vocabulary?
We have, yeah, that's one of the problems I have to admit. Our organization is in the northern part of Belgium. We are Dutch speaking, so most of our publications are in Dutch. Only if we are dealing or participating in European projects, we write it in English. But last week I had contact with my colleagues from Brandenburg in Germany. And then I used Google Translate to write it in German. And I was glad that my German colleague did some corrections because, but normally most of our publications are in Dutch. But I had it once with my Maltese colleagues in the Cocoon project that they were interested in some of our publication. I sent it to them in Dutch, and with Google Translate they get the essence of what we are writing. So if somebody is interested, they can always contact me with what kind of specific item that they want, and I can give them provide them the publications that we have in Dutch, but they can do translation.
Okay, I would like to thank you very much for your interesting presentation on waste management, and I think it's the starting and ending point of this topic in a sense. So I think it's a very important element. I would really like to thank you for your talk here. I think it is time to introduce to you the next speaker of this morning. With us is Pierre Condamine from Zero Waste Europe, with an educational background in political science and Thank you very much.
I have to leave, sorry. It was a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you very much for joining us.
Bye.
With an educational background in political science and a master's in sustainable development, Pierre decided to dedicate his professional life to protecting the environment. He is then determined to make the change towards a zero waste society happen at European level, along with promoting citizens' empowerment at local level. Mr. Condamine will introduce to you the organization of Zero Waste Europe. And without further ado, I'd like to give you the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And hi to everybody. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's hope it works. We can see my screen, right? Yes, it works. Cool. Okay, so hello everybody. My name indeed is Pierre Condamine. I work as a waste policy officer at Zero Waste Europe, and I've been doing that for the past 3 years and a half. And so, yeah, given the topic of today, I'm going to try to describe a bit what we do as Zero Waste Europe, because we do a lot of things, but we are based in Brussels, where the legislation is slowly moving towards a circular economy, and a lot of pieces of legislation are becoming more and more, more promoting circular economy, and that's what I'm going to try to describe a bit today, what we're doing and within which context. But first, a few words about Zero Waste Europe. So we are an NGO that is based in Brussels, but we have been active for around 10 years now, a bit more. We are not only us in Brussels, but we are a network of national NGOs. So now we have 32 NGOs in 28 countries across Europe. And our goal is to achieve a Zero Waste Europe, that's in the title, and that's to eliminate waste from our society with the very strong European angle. We do many things. We are first and foremost a movement building and facilitation organization, meaning that the work we do with our network, with a lot of NGOs, is about movement building. So making sure that they get the right information, that they get access to knowledge. For example, that is, if there is a good practice on circular economy happening in Romania, we want to extract it, translate it in English, or make it available for everybody in the EU. And with this example I gave is a great resource if we want to do EU policymaking, to say that there is this circular practice that is working in Spain, Romania, or Germany, and then that means we should make it a European legislation. And the last bit of our work is to implement zero waste strategies on the ground, not something that we do ourselves, but again, through our network, through the best practices they have, they try to implement zero waste strategies on the ground. And I'm going to describe what it means exactly a bit later. But what is zero waste? And especially in the context of circular economy, what is the link? So we have a definition about what zero waste is, and it's the conservation of all resources. That means better production, better consumption, and often less production and consumption, reuse, recycling. And the last bit of it is to phase out the non-sustainable way of treating waste. And that is what we see in the waste hierarchy. It's a zero waste hierarchy, and at the bottom, you have what is unacceptable, and it's often incineration and landfilling, because we lose the value of the product, while in a circular economy, applying zero waste principles, you should always keep the value as much as you can, and maintain and keep the resource, keep the value, and use less of them. And so in that sense, I think zero waste on the ground, if you apply those principles on the ground, is one of the most useful translation of what a circular economy is. Because underground, if we're talking about cities, zero waste would be very different from a traditional waste management, in the sense that traditional waste management is often centralized. You have one big plant, often it's an incineration plant, and you rely only on that. It's often capital intensive, a lot of money going there, and you have not one sustainable treatment if you burn waste. And at the end, it locks in waste generation, because we know if you have such a centralized, such a capital intensive system, it's not really flexible. And in the case of an incineration plant, you often have a contract for 20 to 25 years. That means you need to feed it in a way if you want it to be profitable. So you need to have a sustainable, like a constant amount of non-sorted waste to make sure the plant is running. While zero waste tries to be more flexible, decentralized, so not only relying on one solution, but many different solutions. In the case of bio-waste treatment, you can have the right adjustment between home composting for those who have a garden. You can have decentralized composting, community composting in a neighborhood where you can have it, but you can also have collection of your bio waste at home that is then going to a composting plant. And so when you have this more flexible zero waste approach, it creates more job because it's more decentralized, so you have more technical infrastructure to treat the waste, but also it identifies and reduces the waste, because you not only send it to a place where it will disappear, but you make it visible through different practices, through like pay as you throw, for example, where people can act on the waste they produce, where they can pay a fee that is dependent upon the quantity of waste they produce. And so by doing so, you enable waste reduction policies, because really you make the waste visible, and so you are more inclined to reduce it. And really to implement this on the ground, we have a zero waste cities program, which is really about pushing cities and municipalities to adopt a zero waste strategy. And that's again not something we do in Brussels, but through our network. So we develop guidelines, case studies, good practices that they can use then to make their work on the ground more efficient, to have more examples. And it's not something that is happening only in Europe. It's also something that we do through our wider network in Asia Pacific, in Latin America, in the US, in Africa, and so on. And you will see that in Europe, you have a lot of cities, zero waste cities, so cities who committed to zero waste, but most of them are still in Italy and Slovenia, because that's where the movement has been created, and that's where they're really good practices. And the idea of zero waste cities and communities is really to phase out waste, not burning or landfilling it, but instead to create a system that will not generate waste in the first place. And again, linked to what I described earlier through case studies. So this is a picture of a case study on Salacea, a city in Romania that has, in 6 months, made really good results on waste management. But we also have a yearly report on zero waste municipalities that we try to update every year. But we also organize study tours in cities where there are good practices in place. Although now with COVID, it's less study tours, but more webinars where we showcase the good practices on the ground. And for the cities, there are many benefits, but the first one is to have less waste to manage, and that reduces the fees for the citizens, that reduces the fee for waste management, and of course less negative environmental impacts. And since it's really based on the community, for example, pushing for zero waste shops, when it comes to bio waste, having, you know, a local composting, that creates more of your sense of community and more social integration and more local job. But this was until now very theoretical, so I'm going to try to describe how it happens in Europe through concrete examples, and also within the frame of the European Union and what it is doing on circular economy. But first, to start with circular economy and climates, I think the link is often undermined and underestimated, but there is this study from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation that is saying that 45% of our greenhouse gas emission are due to the way we produce products. We extract resources, we produce product, and then we consume them. And so in that sense, circular economy as practices across the whole value chain has a role to play and can act on almost half of the greenhouse gas emission. And we know that some of the big issues when it comes to circular economy, waste, and climate are plastic. We know that CO2 coming from plastic is increasing, and it's in the US, for instance, we estimate that the CO2 footprint of plastic might be as high as the one of coal plants by 2030. So that's something quite big. And then the other obvious example is food waste, where it is estimated that food waste contributes to 8 to 10% of the global CO2 emission. And so there is really a need to tackle this, to implement circular economy and zero waste practices from a climate perspective. When it comes to the EU, just going very briefly on this, there is a legal framework that has been adopted in 2018, and those are targets for recycling, for preparation for reuse, and for landfilling. This is what is in place. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you see that they're recycling targets. And recycling is only about using the resource once again, but doesn't say anything about waste prevention or reuse. And so here on our website, you can find examples. You can find this in the timeline of everything that is happening. But then with the current mandates of the European Union, there has been changes and strategies and new ambition that are not in place yet, but that have been mentioned. The most famous one is the European Green Deal, which is about making the European Union carbon neutral by 2050. And within the European Green Deal, there are two packages, let's say, on circular economy and on zero waste. The first one is the Circular Economy Action Plan. So really to focus on waste prevention, reduce the waste that we're producing. And the second one is the Farm to Fork strategy. That is on agriculture, but that includes then also food waste. The most important one and the big one is the Circular Economy Action Plan. And here are the few objectives that are coming. So their waste prevention objective. For instance, they want to reduce by a half the quantity of residual waste that is produced in the EU by 2030. There is discussion to stop the export of waste outside of the EU, and also to boost waste collection systems to make it more harmonized across the European Union. But as I say here, it's a roadmap. So that means those are ambitions and objectives, but so far, nothing here is legally adopted or binding. That might come this year or next year, probably. Within this frame, what we do with zero waste is to try to have the best implementation of those principles of circular economy on the ground. And we develop tools. So for instance, this is the Zero Waste City Saving Calculator, where a city, depending on its strategy to recycle more, to prevent waste, can estimate roughly the amount of CO2 that is saved or money that will be saved. But coming to a more concrete example, one of the best zero waste region we have is the region of Treviso in Italy, where you can see that there has been a huge effort made on recycling and separate collection of waste and sorting and so on, and that now you have you have an 85% recycling rate, and that is one of the best examples we can find in the world, and that has also contributed to reduce the fee for household, the fee for waste management. Another good example that I mentioned already is Slovenia, that here it's not really visible. I mean, the graph is not the best for the eye, but Slovenia in 2008, when one was in the middle of the performance for waste management within the European Union, and 10 years later, you can see that Slovenia is right behind Germany in terms of waste management and recycling. So that's really a country that has adopted zero waste principles and that has boosted separate collection through focusing on bio-waste collection, which is often the most important step to have more recycling, is to collect the bio-waste you produce at home, the food waste you produce at home. And in that sense, Slovenia is really one of the best performing example, with Ljubljana, the capital, that has committed to a zero waste strategy in 2015. So the first European capital to really commit to a zero waste plan. And you can see that the quantity of residual waste in there has reduced, and that separate collection and hence recycling has increased a lot between 2004 and 2018. So those are good examples on waste management. But if we want to go more in detail, there is also on food waste prevention and recycling. We have also a good example, the city of Bruges, for instance, in Belgium, that has adopted an ambitious plan for reducing food waste that has made a guide for events on food waste binding. So that means you have to apply it if you're organizing an event on the territory of the city, but also focusing on hospitals. And in one of the hospital, there has been a 43% reduction in terms of food waste. So that's quite a good example. And the city is accompanying the public building, the health building, quite strongly in that. Only on bio-waste management, not on prevention. The region of Pontevedra in Spain has used decentralized composting. So really in your neighborhood, you can have a composting site, and they're relying on this to compost most of the bio-waste in the region. But because it is decentralized as well, there is not a high density of population. So that means they can use this flexible, low cost, and quite easy to use system. And after 2 years of starting the project, they're already showing really good results. But it's not only about what can be done in the city, although through this city work, you can have like a sort of environment that is good for sustainable business, for zero waste businesses to thrive. And so I'm not going to describe a lot of them, but only 2 of them that I think are really good sustainable businesses on zero waste. I think those are some of the best examples we can find in Europe. The story of Repack. So it's a case study we developed on Repack, which is a company that is using reusable, posting packaging. So if you receive a delivery from ordering online, you can pay an extra fee, and you will receive it in a reusable packaging, and then you give it back to the nearest post, and they give you back the deposits. And this is working quite well and spreading across Europe. But also in Catalonia, there is the story of Rewind, which is really a a project for reusable wine bottles. So once you buy the bottle, you give it back, and instead of being broken and recycled, it will be washed and then reused. And that is obviously better for the environment, as you can see here some numbers in terms of CO2 savings. But that's already a lot of me talking, and on our website we have a lot of other examples on secondhand, on reducing plastic at the local level, and so on. But yeah, and also you will have access to my presentation, so you can also explore all of this. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Pierre, for this very interesting presentation. I must say that this is a topic that is personally very much touching my heartstrings every single time. During the pandemic, I got to go outside more in my area, and I saw a lot of people fly tipping, and I was so annoyed, and I was only complaining. And then I decided to become a volunteer for a local initiative where we are basically hunting fly tippers. So it's small steps that matter. So great job you are doing in your network. I see many people are equally as interested as I am in your work, because we seem to have received a number of questions for you. So I hope that you are ready to answer these. Do you provide resources on preventing packaging waste for people seeking to start their own business?
So no, we don't do that specifically. We are not yet. I think that's something we would like to develop more in the future, so really to help businesses, zero waste businesses, but we don't do that yet. I think that's something that might come in the future, but we have a lot of resources on our website. If you go to our website, you have good examples like the case studies I mentioned, but you'll have also guidance on reusable packaging versus single-use packaging. And also we have developed case studies on zero waste shops and how they work, and so on. So we have a lot of resources on helping businesses not ready. We don't do it already, but I don't want to jinx it, but some of my colleagues are working on something that is like this, and that is called the Mission Zero Academy. And yeah, you can check it out. I think now we do that for cities, so to help them develop zero waste practices, but soon I think we want to move forward and do that for businesses. I'm not involved in the project, but I know this is coming, so I would suggest, if you want to do that, to frequently check out the website and see if there is anything for businesses, because I know it will come soon.
Okay, thank you. This seems to be very interesting as a resource indeed. You spoke about the zero waste cities. How long would it take for cities to implement such a strategy?
So it depends. We have, in a way, a light procedure, because to become a zero waste city, you have to pledge to implement a zero waste strategy. But it's not only like for greenwashing and you have the label, because one of the mandatory steps is within the city to have a zero waste board that is formed with the municipality staff. And then every 2 or 3 years, there is a report made by the city on the progress they have made. So to become a zero waste city as such, it's quite easy. I mean, you still need to go through the municipal decision process. But then if you want to see the first results, I mean, it depends on the size of the city. One example I showed was Salacea in Romania. That's a city of 3,000 inhabitants. And after 6 months, they went already from 3% of recycling to, I think, 40 or 60%. So that's separate collection, not recycling, but sorting. So that's already really good. Then for other cities, yeah, depending on the size, it is bigger. For instance, Milan, the city of Milan, it's not a zero waste city as such, but they have a really good system for collecting and recycling bio waste and food waste. And they had to implement a system for a city of 1.4 million inhabitants. And I would say it took around 5 to 6 years to have results. So that really depends on the size of the city, but yeah, so from 6 months to 6 years, I think even the biggest city after 6 years could show great results.
Okay. And I see that our participant Jean-Pierre has pasted the question in the chat as well. In the zero waste model, how many people are trained to work in this area? If it's not clear, Jean-Pierre is here and maybe she can clarify the question herself.
I think it's clear, although I don't have the number. We are training people. We have training sessions sometimes, but I don't know, we don't have a specific training certificate that we hand out at the end. But we are, yeah, we have 32 NGOs part of the network, and many of them people are trained, but I don't have the exact visibility on how many.
Excuse me, maybe the question is not more in terms of number, but in terms of impact, because you say that in this new model, create job. And then I make the link with the higher number of unemployed young people, even less young people. And I was wondering, yeah, how many people are trained for this, and how can people be trained? Is there any specific training? And if the model creates more jobs, at which level this model creates more jobs?
Yeah.
Is it more high qualified jobs, low, middle qualified, low qualified? I ask the question because I'm active in the association in my municipality, and especially in the local agency of employment. And I'm very interested in, and also because I'm very, comment on dit, inquiété.
Worried.
I wonder, what are we going to do with all these young people who don't work or don't have a job, you know, and who are less qualified? Because we know that our social security will not last all the time. Okay, so maybe it's a very complex question, but yeah.
Yeah, so I cannot give you like a precise answer for all of this, but what I'm doing is putting in the chat a report that our wider network has done on really job and zero waste. And so, well, it's like 15 pages long, so we're not going to go through that. Where you can see on the second page that there is the pyramid, the hierarchy, and you can see the amount of job. Well, actually, maybe I can. Wait, I can maybe share my screen actually very briefly. So I think you should be able to see it. So you can see that when I say it's decentralized and creating more job, is that, yeah, if you have a landfill or incineration plants, you don't need a lot of people, you know, to operate them. But then if you have composting, that you have a lot more labor needed to make it work. If it's recycle or reuse or repair, is even more jobs. Then you'll have a whole example of where exactly the jobs are created. But it's not that we have job created through the zero waste theory, but it's more when you apply it on the ground, you have more jobs created in the waste management system. It's mostly, as you can see, job on making the compost plant operating, or if you have a reuse center, people repairing the object or gathering them. But so yeah, that is this type of job. So really, manual jobs more than manual jobs mostly.